Happy Monday, everybody. Hope you're having a good day today so far. Hope you had a great weekend. I had a pretty good weekend. Not much really happened. I know, once again, I did not upload a Sunday Funday episode. We've just been getting busy, so there's really just never any time lately to do any recording. And also, I just didn't feel like it because I've been watching a lot of podcasts, reading a lot of articles, trying to figure out exactly what is going on with Russia, Ukraine, who's to blame, who's involved in it, because as most people probably know, when war breaks out, it's not always black and white. There's always nuance to when things happen, and I just have questions. I have questions about what's happening. And let me just start off by saying that I am not pro-Putin. I do not think that he is a good man. I think that he is a very bad guy. And, he's authoritarian. He's a dictator. I don't know exactly what category you would put him in, just because I don't really know much about Russia in general. Other than I do know that growing up, I was always taught that Russia was bad, that Putin is bad. I have a hard time, and then I'll get into the actual episode, but I have a hard time with seeing our leaders here in America, Justin Trudeau, people in Australia. I have a hard time hearing them condemn Putin for what he is doing and saying that he's violating human rights and this is a humanitarian issue. And it's like, our leaders in these countries, they have no moral high ground to condemn Putin when here in our own countries they are violating our human rights and taking away our freedoms here. Just look at what happened in Ottawa with the Freedom Convoy. Look what happened with all of the protesters on January 6th. It's ridiculous that they think that they have some moral superiority to condemn Putin when they are just as bad. I mean, they may not be going to war and invading another country, but they are actually declaring war on their own citizens. A Cold War. I mean, well, no, not really, because they are using weapons sometimes. So it's very hard. They talk about, the West has to spread democracy and we stand for freedom, but we're not even free in our own countries anymore. The West, that was predicated on people being free, they're no longer free. You may be freer than some other people, like Texas is freer than probably, California. But we're, as a whole, as a nation, as Canada as a whole, and Australia, New Zealand, we're not free anymore. So it's very hard. The hypocrisy is thick, but you can't call out the hypocrisy because the left does not care. They know they're hypocrites. They have no standards. It's not going to do any good to call out their hypocrisy. So, and I used to do that all the time, and I'm not going to do it anymore because it does you no good to call it out. So, let's get into the episode. I will say from the forefront, I don't know much about foreign policy. And like I said, I don't know really what's going on with Russia and Ukraine. I know some history. I know some background. But with the fact that the Russian state media lies and skews it to make them look like the good guys, and our media, which isn't supposed to be state-run but is, lies and skews everything to make Russia look like it's the problem and Putin is the only one that's in the wrong here, it's hard to know what's real and what's fake anymore. There's a lot of stuff going around that's supposedly real, but then investigating into it, you find out that it's not. So it's very confusing. And as American citizens, when you hear what the history is and why this is an issue and how this all came to be, and there's probably more further back, but I'm going to start at a starting point. And when you hear what took place, you have to ask yourself, how can you trust them? How can we trust what they're telling us? Because they've lied to us for the last 2.5 years. So how can we trust that what they're saying now is true? And I always see a huge red flag when I see Democrat leaders and Republican leaders coming together in agreement on what is going on, that's a huge red flag to me, because Democrats and conservatives do not agree on anything except when it comes to war. And why is that? Because war benefits them. It makes money. Anyway, so let's read our daily promise really quickly. It says, my soul followeth hard after thee, thy right hand upholdeth me. Psalm 63:8. Praise the Lord that he lifts us up. When we are weak, it is then that he will be strong. Rely upon the Lord your God, for he is your strength, defense, and guide in all your ways. Okay, I want to give you some background history on Russia and Ukraine. I found this at nationofchange.org. The first time I had heard about this story, I was watching a Glenn Beck special, and he talked about it. Now, this was back in, might have been 2019 when I watched this special. So when all of this started happening here recently, I didn't put two and two together. But then when I heard on Slightly Offensive, Elijah Schaefer interviewed George Zamueli, I think is how you say it. And he was giving all of this background. I'm like, I've heard this before. Oh, that's right. Glenn Beck has talked about this before. So this article written by Chris Kattan, I don't know how you say it, Kattan, August 15th of 2018. And it's the U.S. staged a coup in Ukraine. Here's why and how. And it's the truth about the coup in Ukraine, and that it hasn't benefited anyone other than the warmongers, okay? It's very interesting. And I'm sure you could go back and find more history to it, but this is only, I try not to go more than an hour, so I can only do so much. So it says, what's the official narrative about the events in late 2013 and early 2014 in Kiev, Ukraine? There was the spontaneous and peaceful Euromaidan revolution, quote unquote, by the great freedom-loving people, which forced the corrupt Ukrainian president to flee the country, right? Not so simple. There are many intriguing facts about geopolitics, 70 years of U.S. meddling in Ukraine, and covert regime change operations. And I want to point out, now we know that Russia and Trump did not collude to steal the election in 2016, but the Democrats still want you to believe that narrative. And they say that Russia has no right meddling in our politics, but the U.S. has the right to meddle in other countries. Why is it that we think we have the right to meddle in other countries, but no one has a right to meddle in ours? I would say we don't have a right. We need to butt out. We need to stop trying to meddle in other countries. If it's not a direct threat to our sovereignty and our safety, why? Money, power, greed. Those are your answers. Anyway. And this is not just left wing. This is going to involve Republicans, which is devastating. But when you really start looking into politics, you realize that Democrats and Republicans, while they may disagree on policy, they all agree on making money and having power. And they're no better than the other. They have their different ways of going about making money and keeping power. So they're really one and the same. They just run on different policies, right? Okay. So, the U.S. meddling. First, objectively speaking, it's curious that a U.S. Senator, John McCain, and the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State, Victoria Nuland, repeatedly attended political protests in another country. Oh, and Nuland is also the wife of a prominent warmongering neocon, Robert Kagan. And she's also the one who famously said, quote, F the EU, end quote, while discussing the future of Ukraine. Now, if you're a blind viewer, you can't see this, but in the picture below, McCain is standing on the stage next to Ola Tianabak. I'm going to butcher most of these names. The leader of the far-right group called Svoboda, which uses a not-so-subtle logo that combines an N and Z. Get it? And I think they're referring to Nazi. So they were spreading freedom, Freedumb, in Ukraine. And I can see their logo, and it looks like a swastika. It really does. On a yellow band on the arm with the black N and Z, and it looks like someone who didn't know really how to draw a swastika. Anyway, So imagine if Russian or Chinese officials were performing similar stunts at anti-US rallies in Mexico. Victoria Nuland also admitted during a speech in 2014 that the U.S. had spent $5 billion since the 1990s to spread quote-unquote democracy in Ukraine. And then I will post the link in the description to the 1-minute video of her speech. So Soros, NED, and McFaul. So many people roll their eyes when they hear George Soros and think of conspiracy theories. But Soros' own group, IRF, or International Renaissance Foundation, admits in its 2015 annual report that it has spent more than $180 million in Ukraine since 1990. And then there's a picture here. It shows that it's Renaissance. It was founded in 1990. Their total budget was, let's see, $181,465,005. Is that how you say it? I'm really bad at numbers. They had 16,647 projects in 517 cities and villages of Ukraine. 55,500 persons and organizations involved millions of people. Okay. So NED, or National Endowment of Democracy, is a U.S. taxpayer-funded group that specializes in regime change. Its chief, Carl Gershman, wrote in a Washington Post op-ed in 2013, and this was just before the protest started, that, quote, Ukraine is the biggest prize, end quote. Now, Michael McFaul, who is the U.S. ambassador to Russia from 2012 to 2014, wrote an op-ed in WAPO in 2004 where he asked, quote, did Americans meddle in the internal affairs of Ukraine, end quote. And then he answered that question with a yes. So why did McFaul write this article? Because in 2004, Soros and other NGOs, or non-governmental organizations, fomented the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. So basically, the election was won by a pro-Russian guy. So people protested and demanded a new election. Then a month later, the pro-US guy won the new election with 52% of the votes. Democracy, America style. By the way, that guy, Yanukovych, who lost the election in 2004, he ran again in 2010 and he won fair and square. And that's why we had Euromaidan. History rhymes. If you go back in history, you will see that the CIA worked with neo-Nazis and ultra-nationalists in Ukraine for decades, starting right after World War II. Declassified CIA documents describe Project Aerodynamic in the 1950s and 60s that recruited Ukrainian nationalists, including Nazis and war criminals such as Mykola Lebed, who was accused of killing tens of thousands of Poles and Jews, to work against the USSR. So this is a picture of the CIA declassified document called Project Aerodynamic, which was approved for FY 1967 in the amount of redacted, lends support to a Ukrainian, I can't read that word, political group, foreign representation of the Ukrainian Supreme Liberation Council via the Prologue Research and Publishing Association, Inc., and it says, to conduct the clandestine activities of the ZP UHBR. It publishes and dismantles anti-Soviet propaganda and has organized a knot of its collaborators throughout the Western world engaged in contact operations against Soviet citizens traveling in the West and in mailing operations. I probably screwed some of that up. It's very, very hard to read. Okay, this was February 15th of 1967. So now, hopefully, you can clearly see the patterns and that Ukraine is really of special importance to the U.S. But why is it important? Have you ever heard of, I'm going to butcher this, Brzezinski, I don't know, the geopolitical expert who influenced U.S. foreign policy for over 40 years. He came up with the idea of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan to fight the USSR, created Al-Qaeda, and then repeated the same strategy of using Islamic terrorists in the Balkans, the Caucasus, Libya, and Syria. And if you don't know much about the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, you can go back and watch my 9/11 video that I made where I talk all about how that all came to be and where it started, and that 9/11 was the head of that, right? That was the climax of all of that had happened, when Russia tried to invade Afghanistan, and the Mujahideen was formed, and the Americans came in, gave them weapons, and helped them, and they defeated Russia and kicked them out. And then you have Al-Qaeda started, Osama bin Laden, all that. You can go watch that video. So Brzezinski explained in his 1997 book called The Grand Chessboard that, quote, Ukraine is a geopolitical pivot. Without Ukraine, Russia ceases to be a Eurasian empire, end quote. And he also said that Ukraine must be brought into NATO by 2010. And we know that that's something that Russia was demanding that not be allowed to happen because it's right on their border, not to have Ukraine part of NATO. And there were also promises made to Russia that if they didn't invade Ukraine, that we wouldn't expand NATO in the countries on their border. And of course, as the U.S., we don't follow our own treaties that we sign with people, our own peace deals, whatever. We do whatever we want, whenever we want, because for whatever reason, people think that America are the good guys. Not always. Let's be honest. We're not always the good guys. So protest and violence. In 2013, Soros, NED, and other NGOs riled up some ordinary people in Kiev. By the way, outside Kiev, there were no protests. In many parts of Ukraine, people are very pro-Russia, and we're happy with President Yanukovych. So the neo-Nazi thugs acted as provocateurs and attacked the police with medals, chains, firebombs, guns, and grenades. And I've got some pictures here showing you what happened. You have cops being attacked in Euromaidan with stones, Molotov cocktails, chains, and then Ukraine's right-wing use Nazi symbols and leaders. So the Ukrainian government's links to neo-Nazis are never openly admitted in the U.S., but this is the reason why Congress refused to pass a bill that banned funding of neo-Nazi groups. So for fun reading on the far-right extremists in Ukraine, do some research on Zvoboda, Stephen Bandera, and Azov Battalion. And maybe I'll do an episode on that, and we'll look into that stuff and what it is, and Brzezinski. So false flag sniper attack. In a secretly recorded phone call in 2014, Estonia's foreign minister revealed 3 shocking facts about the Maidan murders. And I believe the Estonia foreign minister is the woman that George Zamueli was talking about on Elijah Schaffer's show about overthrowing the democratically elected president, Yanukovych. Okay. So these are the facts. The same sniper bullets killed both the cops and the protesters. The investigators strongly believe that the new coalition was behind the snipers, and by new coalition, he means the new government installed by the U.S., because Zelensky is backed by the U.S., he's influenced by us, and the new government refused to look into the matter. A couple of years later, in an Italian documentary called The Hidden Truth About Ukraine, some men from the Republic of Georgia came forward and admitted that they were used as snipers in Kiev. As I describe in details in my book, similar sniper attacks were used in Libya and Syria as well to foment regime changes. In summary, to advance misguided geopolitical goals, the U.S. and the EU officials engineered protests and chaos and drove a democratically elected president out of the country. Then, without an election, new oligarchs, a billionaire, and an IMF guy were handpicked by the West to become the president and the prime minister of Ukraine. Democracy in action. And because of this, well, we'll get to it. So the conclusion is that the truth about the coup in Ukraine, and it hasn't benefited anyone other than the warmongers. Ukraine is split in half and stuck in a frozen civil war. Its debt to GDP ratio has doubled. Pensions, social services, and minimum wages, which is about $140 a month, have been slashed, and the people are still ruled by corrupt oligarchs. The regime change ops also ignited a chain reaction of needless hostility, hysterical Russophobia, and crippling sanctions. The EU has lost more than $100 billion in trade with Russia in the last 4 years, and the US has pushed Russia deep into China's orbit. Just like the neocon adventures in Iraq and Syria, the meddling in Ukraine will go down as another disastrous US foreign policy. And that's one of the other things about the U.S. getting involved and doing this and overthrowing the democratically elected president, I can't even say his name. Yanukovych. I don't know. So they overthrow him. They install someone that's influenced by the West, which is Zelensky. So there were people that were in Ukraine that are pro-Russia that would not recognize him as the president because they knew it was illegitimate. And this kicked off a civil war. And there's been a civil war going on over there for the last 8 years or more. And the last I checked, over 3,000 people have died. About 850,000 people have been displaced and have nowhere to go. But this is something that most people don't even know that this happened and that this is going on. In fact, because I didn't follow politics when George W. Bush was president, or when Obama was president, I didn't know that Russia, invaded Georgia under President Bush. And I didn't know that Russia invaded Crimea under Obama. But under Trump, they didn't even make a move because they didn't know exactly what Trump would do. They were not going to call his bluff. And this is why he waited until Biden got in office, because Biden is weak. He's a vegetable. Our military is a joke with what we are showing it to be about diversity and inclusion, instead of about being powerful and able to protect our country. So, this was the perfect time to make a move because he knew nothing would happen. And that's why I say this is not just Putin bad and invading Ukraine just because he can. No, there are more fingers to be pointed. If the U.S. had stayed out of it and minded their own business and not staged a coup in Ukraine, maybe this wouldn't be happening. But this is why the Minsk Accords failed to bring Ukraine peace. So this is something that was involved as well. This is by Mark Champion. So in an attempt to avert a major war in Europe, France and Germany, backed by the U.S., pressed for implementation of the controversial Minsk peace accords as the best chance for a solution to Russian demands on Ukraine. The package of agreements, which they helped negotiate with Russia after Ukrainian military defeats in 2014 and 2015, were complex, hotly disputed, and went to the heart of what is at root a struggle over Ukrainian identity and sovereignty. On February 24th, Russian forces attacked targets across Ukraine after President Vladimir Putin pronounced the agreements dead. So how did the Minsk deals come about? The accord sought to halt the armed conflict that broke out in eastern Ukraine in 2014. The country's pro-Russia leader, Viktor Yanukovych, had just been ousted by mass protests in the capital, Kiev, triggered by his decision, under pressure from Putin, to renege on a trade pact with the European Union. Now, obviously, that is the story we're told. We know it was actually a coup. So, you can choose to believe which side you want. I choose to believe that the U.S. meddled and staged a coup and took over. Smaller protests against the new government in Kiev followed throughout eastern and southern Ukraine, with armed Russia-backed separatists seizing territory in the, I don't know how you say it, the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, together known as the Donbass. Although the Kremlin denies involvement, Ukraine has claimed, and open-source investigations in the West and Russia have put forward evidence that Russian forces intervened directly to turn the tide of the fighting and inflict two crushing defeats on Ukrainian forces. Each loss was followed by a peace deal reached in Minsk, the capital of neighboring Belarus. Now, I've also heard that these two regions, that Russia did not intervene. He was asked, because they've been fighting this civil war, and they asked for help because they feel like they are Russian. Anyway. There's a picture here that says Russia recognizes separatist regions. Putin signs decrees recognizing self-proclaimed Donetsk and Luhansk republics. Ukraine was also supposed to recognize them and legitimize these regions as separate regions and Russian regions, and they did not do that. So what do the accords say? So Minsk 1, reached in September 2014, had 12 points, including a ceasefire to be monitored by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, a law on Ukraine's decentralization with temporary special status for the separatist-held territory, local elections, an amnesty, and other issues. As fighting continued, a follow-up memorandum 2 weeks later required heavy weapons to be pulled back from the front lines. The truce again struggled to hold amid disputes over sequencing and finally collapsed in January 2015. Minsk, too, followed a month later, amid renewed heavy fighting and with Ukrainian troops surrounded in the town of Debaltseve. The new deal's 13 points included more detailed, but also confusing language on the settlement sequencing and political requirements. So why have they been so hard to implement? One problem was that though Russia negotiated the Minsk deal, it said it was not a party to the conflict and therefore not responsible for implementation. Ukraine says it was. Beyond that, there were at least 3 key disputes. The first was who should be in control when elections were held. Still more difficult was that the deal says the special status for the Donbass region and arguably Ukraine's constitutional restructuring have to be made, quote, in consultation and agreement with, end quote, the leaders of the self-proclaimed Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics through a specially formed group. Potentially the most dangerous dispute was over the extent of the special status territory, which was left undefined. The separatist leaders said it should include all of the Donetsk and Luhansk provinces, more than half of which remains under Kiev's control. Now in Moscow's eyes, they have legal standing to make those claims as leaders of sovereign states and to invite Russian troops to help. Number 4, how did Russia interpret the accords? Russia saw Minsk as a deal Ukraine signed and was obliged to fulfill, returning the Donbass to Kiev's control while ensuring the safety and rights of the area's citizens, as many as 800,000 of whom have now received Russian passports. That's roughly 20 to 40% of the population, depending on estimates. Moscow also saw the accords as creating wide autonomy for Donbass and as a means to federalize Ukraine, making it in practice impossible for the country to join Western institutions such as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization or the European Union. At a February meeting of the United Nations Security Council, Russia complained specifically about a Ukrainian pledge that, quote, none of Ukraine's regions will be able to veto statewide decisions, end quote, and that France, Germany, and the U.S. had failed to pressure Ukraine to implement the agreement. Kremlin officials didn't define the form this federalization should take, but Vladislav Surkov, Putin's Ukraine advisor until 2020, said after leaving office that Minsk II was written to give Ukraine, quote, symbolic sovereignty over the East of the kind the British monarch exercises over Canada or Australia. So what about Ukraine? Ukraine passed a law on decentralization as required by the Minsk agreement, but it was not negotiated with the separatists seen by Kiev as Moscow's proxies and was therefore rejected by Russia. The government said it was committed to implementing the accords, just not as Russia interpreted them. It prepared draft bills for that purpose, but insisted that security should be ensured first. Speaking out of turn, Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council Secretary Alexei Danilov went further, telling the Associated Press in January that fulfilling the Minsk Accords, quote, signed under a Russian gun barrel, would destroy Ukraine as a country. Even a limited effort to implement the accords in 2015 led to violent protests in Kiev. A December 2021 poll found that 75% of Ukrainians thought the Minsk Accords should either be amended or abandoned. Just 12% thought that they should be implemented. But that's not the point. The point is these accords were made and they had agreements, and Ukraine and Kiev did not implement them as they said they would. And the countries, the U.S., Germany, France, that said that they would back it and make sure that it was implemented, also did nothing. So what did the French and Germans say? France and Germany were central to negotiation of the Minsk Accords and to talks in the 7 years since under the so-called Normandy format, which includes those 2 countries, Russia and Ukraine, to implement them. They argued, as did Russia until it declared the territories independent states, that the agreements were the only available route to a diplomatic solution to the crisis. Both French President Emmanuel Macron and German Chancellor Olaf Scholz shuttled between Moscow and Kiev in February in an effort to reinvigorate the Normandy process. So where did the agreements leave Ukraine? Minsk reduced the Donbass conflict to limited trench warfare for 7 years, yet each side blames the other for the failure to implement key terms. Prior to the Russian attacks on February 24th, the fighting had already killed about 14,000 people and left more than 1.4 million internally displaced within Ukraine, according to government data. So this is more updated information than I had. It was always difficult to see a solution emerging because, as Duncan Allen, an analyst at the Chatham House think tank in London, wrote in a study, the accords, quote, rest on two irreconcilable interpretations of Ukraine's sovereignty. Is Ukraine sovereign, as Ukraine insists, or should its sovereignty be limited, as Russia demands? So, I hope this is kind of giving you an outline and a picture of what's really happening, because there is so much more to it, right? And I feel as American citizens, with our government being involved, we have a right to know what is truly taking place. And like I said, there is so much more nuance. This is not just Putin invading just because he can. I'm not saying he's right. I'm not saying it's good that what is happening. Obviously, war is never good unless it's a just cause. But I'm trying to look at this from a different perspective and understand it from all sides, because we can't always look at things from one point of view, right? So Putin feels like he's doing what's right for the sovereignty and security of Russia. I believe, and maybe it has more underlying reasons. Maybe there are. But when you try to look at this as a whole, he feels like Russia is being threatened, especially because agreements and accords were made and nobody has held up to those agreements. It's not right. You don't make agreements and not hold up to them. If you make an agreement with another country, the only time you violate it is if the other country violates it first. Because once it's violated, then you're not making any violations. You're counteracting to someone already violating an agreement that was made. And clearly Ukraine, Kiev, France, Germany, the US, the West as a whole, NATO, nobody did the things that they said that they would do when these agreements were made. So Russia's making a move to protect its sovereignty and its security for its citizens. Let's talk about why America is not going to send troops to fight in Ukraine. Now, I'm of the opinion that no, we should not be sending our troops over there. Why does it always have to be American troops that go to these other countries to defend and fight for other people? Why are other countries that are supposed to be the allies as well not willing to step in and do their part? The U.S. has always done that. And I do not believe that our sons and daughters should be sent there to possibly die to fight for something that is kind of our fault as a nation. It's also Germany's. It's also France's. It's NATO's. Those countries need to step up and send troops over to Ukraine to fight. It doesn't always have to be the U.S. We are not the world police. Unlike so many people that think that we are, we're not. And it is not our job to spread democracy. It's not. We need to butt out sometimes. Anyway, so this is from republicworld.com, and it is written by Vishnu. VV is what it says. So, in view of Russia-Ukraine war, U.S. President Joe Biden has said that the U.S. will not be sending troops to Ukraine. President Biden, while speaking in an address, slammed Russia and its invasion of Ukraine. However, he also cleared that no U.S. troops will be sent to Ukraine to take part in the conflict. Joe Biden on Thursday unveiled new sanctions against Moscow, further suggesting that removing Russia from the SWIFT international financial system is always an option. Accusing Putin of going forward with a premeditated attack, Biden said such action may be on the table as the crisis unfolds. However, he said that the U.S. will not directly be involved in the ongoing war. Quote, "Our forces are not and will not be engaged in the conflict. Our forces are not going to Europe to fight in Ukraine, but to defend our NATO allies and reassure those allies in the East," he said while explaining the U.S. troops' movement to Europe. Earlier, Biden had explained that the sanctions put forth by the U.S. were defensive and not an attack on Russia. Also, I just want to point out while I'm talking about this, Hillary Clinton was on TV and suggested cyber attacks against Russia. That we should be using cyber attacks right now. Which cyber attacks on another country is a declaration of war. Just like implementing a no-fly zone over Ukraine would be a declaration of war. And if you implement a no-fly zone, you better be willing to back it up by shooting down any Russian military plane that flies through. And I would probably think that Putin would call Biden's bluff because he's been weak and he hasn't done anything. He's been weak on China. He's been weak on Russia. He's a very weak leader. At this point, I'll get to that point in a minute. He says, let me be clear, these are totally defensive moves on our part. We have no intention of fighting Russia, Biden said. Responding to the media on queries whether there was any chance of him sending U.S. troops to evacuate Americans in Ukraine, Biden said that there wasn't one. There's not. That's a world war when Americans and Russians start shooting at one another, he had said. Meanwhile, Biden on Thursday approved the deployment of 7,000 additional U.S. troops to Germany in a bid to assist NATO allies in the face of the Russian invasion. So we cause a war in Ukraine, but we don't help them. We're just going to help our allies. I thought Ukraine was our ally, even though they aren't a part of NATO. I thought we were supposed to be allies with Ukraine. Clearly, we're not. We just used Ukraine for our benefit, and now we're just going to leave them to suffer. And like I said, while I don't think we should be sending our troops, it's just crazy that some of this stems from us meddling in Ukraine. So, according to the Pentagon's official statement, the 7,000 troops which will be deployed to Germany will include an armored brigade combat team with associated capabilities and enablers. The statement added that the American troops will leave in the coming days. The announcement by the U.S. Department of Defense has brought the total U.S.-based forces sent this month to Europe to 12,000. In his remarks from the White House, Biden said, quote, now I am authorizing additional... Someone doesn't know how to spell authorizing. Now I am authorizing additional U.S. force capabilities to deploy to Germany as part of NATO's response, including some of the U.S.-based forces that the Department of Defense placed on standby weeks ago. He reiterated that the forces were being sent to Europe in a bid to assist NATO allies and not to fight in Ukraine. The move also came as the U.S. and its allies have imposed a range of sanctions on the Russian economy as well as the banking systems. Russian troops have been pressing the fight in Ukraine since Thursday, and I know that they've reached Kiev. I can't remember who I heard say it. I want to say it was Ben Shapiro, but somebody said that it's very easy to overtake a country, but holding it and keeping it is going to be very hard for Russia. So, it's just something we're going to have to follow. Let's see. There's another article here about the coup in Ukraine in 2014. I don't know. Maybe I'll read that in a minute. But first I want to read this analysis from Ben Shapiro. Here's why Putin invaded Ukraine and how he just shattered the world order. So, Russia has now invaded Ukraine. The invasion has been a long time in the making. Contrary to Putin's protestations and those of his apologists, the invasion of Ukraine was never about concerns over Ukraine joining NATO. First off, the claim that Ukrainian membership would threaten Russia's border is absurd on its face. Estonia and Latvia have been members of NATO for years, and both border Russia. Furthermore, the question of Ukrainian membership in NATO has been a relative dead letter since approximately 2010, when Viktor Yanukovych took over the presidency of the country. Entry into NATO is not realistic for our country today, he stated at the time. In 2016, President of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, estimated it would take 20 to 25 years for Ukraine to join NATO and the EU. Yanukovych's successor, Petro Poroshenko. So Petro Poroshenko is the one that was overthrown. I had it wrong. I think Poroshenko was the one that was overthrown. Anyway, Petro Poroshenko signed a constitutional amendment dedicating the country to seeking membership in NATO and the EU in 2019, but acknowledged that the country was a long way from meeting membership criteria. In reality, Ukraine has flirted with both NATO and Russia for a long time, maintaining a stance of strategic independence. So what drove Putin? The answer comes from Putin's own mouth. Just days ago, he gave a militant speech in which he said, quote, "Ukraine is not just a neighboring country for us. It is an inalienable part of our own history, culture, and spiritual space. Since time immemorial, the people living in the southwest of what has historically been Russian land have called themselves Russians," end quote. He added that Ukraine had been created by the Soviets and that it was time to reconstitute the Russian Empire. Quote, "The disintegration of our united country was brought about by the historic strategic mistakes on the part of Bolshevik and Soviet leaders," Putin said. "The collapse of the historical Russia known as the USSR is on their conscience. According to Putin, Ukrainians are being subjected to tyranny by Western powers." I don't know why. I don't know if I can... I don't doubt that that's a possibility. We get into everything. I mean, we have our fingers in every pie. Ukraine itself was placed under external control, directed not only from the Western capitals, but also on the ground, as the saying goes, through an entire network of foreign advisors, NGOs, and other institutions present in Ukraine. Are the Ukrainian people aware that this is how their country is managed? Do they realize that their country is turned not even into a political or economic protectorate, but has been reduced to a colony with a puppet regime? Why now? Putin has offered a variety of excuses for his action. He says that it has been welcomed into Ukraine by separatists in eastern Ukraine, but he is invading Kiev itself. He says that Ukraine wants its own nuclear weapons, a wild accusation given that Ukraine gave up its 5,000 nuclear weapons in 1994 at the behest of both Russia and the United States. He says that America does, quote, "not need a big independent country like Russia around. This is the answer to all questions," end quote. The real reason Putin is moving now is threefold. Now, I don't always agree with Ben Shapiro. I just want to put that out at the forefront. I may not agree with some of what he's saying, because I feel like nobody can know truly the real reasons of why Putin is doing what he's doing right now at this moment. It's speculation. Only Putin can tell us exactly what he's thinking and why, and he doesn't have to be honest about it either. So first, Russia has a major advantage right now: natural gas and oil. Europe has spent the last decade destroying its own energy capacity at the behest of Greta Thunberg and company. Simultaneously, they have shipped in enormous amounts of Russian carbon-based fossil fuel. 1/3 of all EU natural gas is provided by Russia at this point, and the price of natural gas, which was low in the 2015 to 2020 period, has now skyrocketed, giving him tremendous bargaining power. Indeed, Deputy Chair of the Security Council for Russia, Dmitry Medvedev, tweeted, quote, "German Chancellor Olaf Scholz has issued an order to halt the process of certifying the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline. Well, welcome to the brave new world where Europeans are very soon going to pay £2 for 1 cubic meter of natural gas?" I don't know their things. There's a reason that the West has thus far exempted Russian energy markets from sanctions. According to the State Department, it would do too much economic damage. Yeah, this is the other thing. We are spending millions of dollars on barrels of oil from Russia right now at this moment. So we're condemning this war, but we are simultaneously financing this war. And we have more than enough of our own natural gas and oil in our own country to supply ourselves. Alaska, Oklahoma, Texas. There is enough oil to support our own country. We don't have to be getting it from Russia. We don't have to be getting it from Saudi Arabia. We just need to open back up our XL pipeline and provide it for ourselves, and gas prices would go down. So, a reminder, our gas prices have not skyrocketed because of this war with Russia. It has skyrocketed because of the pipelines being shut down. Anyway, so, second, The West has demonstrated utter incapacity to challenge Putin's prior predations. He invaded Georgia in 2008 to no serious consequences. He invaded Crimea and Luhansk and Donetsk in 2014 to no serious consequences. And like I said, not everybody believes the story about the coup. So some people believe he invaded those two provinces, and others are saying that they asked for Putin to come and help. Even while the United States complains about Putin's Ukrainian adventure, Special Climate Envoy John Kerry maintains that we must work with Russia on climate change. Quote, I hope President Putin will help us to stay on track with respect to what we need to do with the climate, end quote. Why are people so focused on other things when people are literally dying in a war right now? I saw a post on Twitter about someone talking about Ukrainians being crowded together, but only 35% of them were vaccinated and less than 2% were boosted. Like, vaccines are no matter right now. They're literally getting bombed. I don't think they care about the vaccines. But see, that's the problem when you live here in a first world country that has no real issues other than the ones you create yourself. Continuing on. Even as President Biden condemns Putin, the United States continues to broker with the Russian government to come to a conclusion on an ill-advised nuclear deal with the Iranian mullahs. Putin has no reason to think that any consequences will be either long-lasting or significant. And on a broader level, Putin has watched as the West surrenders to aggressive dictatorial powers repeatedly from Hong Kong in 2020 to Afghanistan in 2021, not to mention our own leaders being dictatorial on its own citizens. So, third, Putin envisions a reimagined world order. He clearly lusts for a return to Russian glory, and he sees that China has oriented itself under Xi Jinping toward a similar purpose. Both Russia and China see themselves as enemies of the United States and are acting accordingly. Putin believes that if he takes Ukraine and Xi takes Taiwan, the West will be put back on its heels. The unipolar era of American power will be effectively ended, and a multipolar world in which Russia plays its historic role will re-emerge. It is the most important rationale that the West simply cannot understand. As it turns out, cultures around the world value more than access to bank accounts and McDonald's. Putin and Xi and the mullahs all think in terms of historic greatness, empire, and national glory. This is particularly true in Russia, where Stalin still bears a 70% approval rating. In Svetlana Alexievic's Nobel Prize-winning book, Secondhand Time, she tells the story of a factory worker imprisoned and tortured by the communist regime. After the end of the Cold War, this factory worker told Alexievic, when I go into my grandchildren's room, everything there is foreign. The shirts, the jeans, the books, the music. Savages. I want to die a communist. That's my final wish. This sentiment was well understood by George Orwell. In 1940, he wrote of Hitler's appeal. So this is George Orwell. He has grasped the falsity of the hedonistic attitude to life. Nearly all Western thought since the last war, certainly all quote-unquote progressive thought, has assumed tactically that human beings desire nothing beyond ease, security, and avoidance of pain. In such a view of life, there is no room, for instance, for patriotism and the military virtues. The socialist who finds its children playing with soldiers is usually upset, but he is never able to think of a substitute for the 10 soldiers. 10 pacifists somehow won't do it. Hitler, because in his own joyless mind he fills it with exceptional strength, knows that human beings don't only want comfort, safety, short working hours, hygiene, birth control, and, in general, common sense. They also, at least intermittently, want struggle and self-sacrifice, not to mention drums, flags, and loyalty parades. However, they may be as economic theories. Fascism and Nazism are psychologically far sounder than any hedonistic conception of life. The same is probably true of Stalin's militarized version of socialism. All three of the great dictators have enhanced their power by imposing intolerable burdens on their peoples, whereas socialism and even capitalism, in a more grudging way, have said to people, quote, I offer you a good time. Hitler has said to them, quote, I offer you struggle, danger, and death. And as a result, a whole nation flings itself at his feet. I get it. I do get it. Many other cultures and countries understand that appeal. In fact, Americans used to believe in a higher purpose for themselves than mere increases in GDP. No longer. In the West, we're not concerned with things as base as national mission or the legacy of Western civilization. We are, in other words, a weak horse. Putin knows that. Xi knows that. The mullahs know that. All of which means that Putin's invasion of Ukraine is merely the first crack in the dam that holds back the flood tides of global chaos. Our material comforts are premised on a global order with the United States at its unchallenged head. Putin has challenged that order. The West seems unlikely to respond. We're too busy blowing out our debt and navel-gazing about climate change, with gender fluidity, with supposed systemic racism, with income inequality. Russia and China can't touch the West in terms of wealth or military might, but without a higher purpose, no country of any GDP can stand up to the naked aggression of nations animated by grim purpose of its own. And there are some people saying that with what Putin is doing with Ukraine right now is kind of like a playbook or a dress rehearsal to what China is then going to do with Taiwan. And it's probably coming next. And I do believe that. I believe China will take over Taiwan next. And I do believe that America will not step in and aid the Taiwanese like we had promised them that we would. We're not going to do anything, especially because Biden is a puppet for China. Now, let's talk about how Russian sanctions could impact American consumers. I feel like with all this going on, obviously we're not directly impacted, like we're not being invaded, we're not being bombed. But that doesn't mean that what's going on half a world away cannot affect you here at home. This is by Ben Zeisloft from the Daily Wire. So, as Russia launched its invasion of Ukraine, Western nations, including the United States, issued a round of sanctions aimed at cutting off Russian financial institutions, restricting debt and equity for Russian corporations, and targeting certain Russian elites. One of those Russian elites would be Putin's former son-in-law, and Boris Johnson issued one of those sanctions like that. And a fact that I learned, Putin's daughter is actually at Rikers right now for some Ponzi scheme that she was a part of. Anyway, but with a GDP of 1.48 trillion, Russia is the world's 11th largest economy, smaller than the United Kingdom, Italy, France, and other countries with fewer human and natural resources. With a GDP per capita of just over $10,000 compared to $63,500 for the United States and $45,700 for Germany, Russia also punches below its weight in terms of economic productivity per citizen. However, sanctions against Russia will still have tangible repercussions for Western consumers. For one, Russia contributes greatly to the global supply of energy. Each year, Russia exports crude petroleum, refined petroleum, petroleum gas, and coal briquettes, to the tune of $123 billion, $66.2 billion, $26.3 billion, and $17.6 billion, respectively. Russia is incredibly unimportant in the global economy except for oil and gas, Harvard economist and former Obama administration advisor Jason Furman told the New York Times earlier this week. It's basically a big gas station. Although the primary impact of any disruptions in oil supply will hit Western Europeans, oil is a fungible resource. Because a barrel of crude oil exported from Saudi Arabia is virtually identical to a barrel of crude oil exported from Russia, the United States, or China, countries with a large share of international oil production have a massive influence over global prices. This is the reality that enables OPEC nations to jointly toggle their exports such that price levels benefit their members. Indeed, as consumers in America and across the world are currently learning, a phenomenon in one corner of the global economy has ripple effects. The current supply chain crisis is induced by COVID-19 lockdowns that paused manufacturing activity in many parts of Asia. Through government and private institutions alike, the same interconnectedness defines the global financial system. Quote, "You have to look at the backdrop against which this is coming," EY Parthenon chief economist Gregory Dacko told the New York Times. There is a high inflation, There is high inflation, strained supply chains, and uncertainty about what central banks are going to do and how insistent price rises are. Beyond the flow of energy and other goods, Russia may retaliate against the United States and its citizens through cyber attacks. Russia was likely behind a cyber attack earlier this year that compromised 70 Ukrainian government websites, and Russian criminals have been known to carry out cyber attacks on American entities, including food suppliers. We have to be realistic and understand that as we impose sanctions, we take actions. There could be blowback here, explained Representative Jim Langvin, a Democrat of Rhode Island, at the Wall Street Journal's recent CIO Network Summit. He advised American companies that they have a role to play, recommending that they implement testing procedures to back up and restore data, institute multi-factor authentication, and patch known vulnerabilities, among other actions. During challenging times such as these, the Russian operatives could be using password spraying attacks, recycling passwords from past password data dumps, and using artificial intelligence, added Fortalice Solutions chief executive and former Bush administration official Teresa Payton. I don't know how true it is, but I've been told that if Russia does use cyber attacks to shut down like our anything, electric grid, anything. Texas, so we run on our own power grid. We're not connected to the rest of the United States. So we can sustain, apparently our grid is powerful enough to sustain the entire country. I don't know how true that is because I've never really looked into it. But I do know that we run on our own electrical grid and we're not connected to them. So if they were to attack any of that and shut the country down, Texas, if they aren't able to gain access by doing cyber attacks in Texas, we should be fine, hopefully. And I saw this quick story really quick about Elon Musk coming to the rescue after the Ukraine government pleaded for his help, by Ryan Severda, and I wanted to know exactly what it was about. So Ukraine posted a tweet and it says, Dear Elon Musk, Ukraine needs your support. Your stance and your actions matter. An appeal by our Minister of Digital Transformation here. So my Mikhailo Fedorov tweeted, Elon Musk, while you try to colonize Mars, Russia tries to occupy Ukraine. While your rocket successfully lands from space, Russian rockets attack Ukrainian civil people. We ask you to provide Ukraine with Starlink stations and to address sane Russians to stand. So Starlink service is now active in Ukraine, Musk responded. More terminals en route. So Fedorov later responded, Starlink terminals are coming to Ukraine. Thank you, Elon Musk. Thank you, everyone who supported Ukraine. The Ukrainian government tweeted, thanks, appreciate it. So Starlink provides high-speed, low-latency broadband internet across the globe. Within each coverage area, orders are fulfilled on a first-come, first-served basis. Using advanced satellites in a low orbit, Starlink enables video calls, online gaming, streaming, and other high data rate activities that historically have not been possible with satellite internet. Starlink is ideally suited for areas where connectivity has been unreliable or completely unavailable. People across the globe are using Starlink to gain access to education, health services, and even communications support during natural disasters. So the plea from Ukrainian government comes after Russian president launched his invasion. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky reportedly refused to be evacuated from the country's capital city of Kiev as Russian military forces attacked the city and surrounding areas. When he was offered, he responded with, the fight is here, I need ammunition, not a ride, which the Daily Wire turned into a t-shirt. Anyone who wants to come over here and defend our country, please come and we will give you arms, Zelensky told the media on Saturday. Anybody defends will have been glorified. Zelensky made the same offer earlier in the week, saying in a statement, we will give weapons to anyone who wants to defend the country. Be ready to support Ukraine in the squares of our cities. We will have sanctions on all citizens of Ukraine who are ready to defend our country as part of territorial defense with weapons in hands. NATO activated the NATO Response Force for the first time ever on Friday, which readies thousands of soldiers who are part of the multinational force consisting of land, air, sea, and Special Operations Forces. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg warned during a press conference on Friday that Putin's objectives are not limited to Ukraine. That's what I've heard. I heard he's not going to stop in Ukraine. He's going to continue forth. I'm not sure. So going back to, really quickly, this article from Strategic Culture Foundation. I'm not going to read it. But this one I am going to link in the description box because this seems to have a little bit more information, and I think it was written before the other one that I read. So I want to share that one in there. I'm going to link all of this in the description below so you can look it all up and check it all out for yourself. Look, I don't know anything about foreign policy. I clearly don't, okay? I don't know anything about much other than what I do research in depth. And this is just something really hard to research because there's a lot of things that are coming out that I see that's happening, and then I'm being told it's not real. Or I'm seeing something that's fake and being told that it's real, but it's not. Like the picture of President Zelensky all dressed up in his gear, ready to fight. That picture that was just released, when you go back and investigate it, the original release of that picture was from April 21st of 2021 when he was visiting a military base in Donbass. So, I'm told that the Snake Island incident, that video where the Russian warship told him to, surrender, and they went back to the Russian warship and on the speaker and told them to go F themselves, and then supposedly all 13 of those people died heroically. There's a video of one of the Ukrainian soldiers on Snake Island that is being held by Russians. They were all supposedly captured peacefully and are still alive. So, like I said, it's very hard to know what's real and what's not. So I guess you just got to look at it all, and then you just have to make a decision for yourself. And you may be wrong, you may be right. I don't think there's any way for us to know for sure until our media starts actually telling the truth, which they're not going to. So this is kind of a just learn it for yourself, and you need to decide what you think is happening, why you think it's happening, who really is to blame. It's not just Putin. Obviously, he's to blame for the invasion because he did it. But who was the one that provoked that? Who started all of that? And I think that it's pretty clear to see who provoked this invasion. Anyway, so I'm going to leave the episode here. I do want to tell you, I'm not going to give her name. I'm not going to show the video because I don't want to give her any more attention. Well, I mean, I guess I have to give you her name so you can go look for it. You need to go look up Anna Lynn McCord's Twitter. Go look at the video that she posted called Dear Mr. President Vladimir Putin, If I Was Your Mother. It is one of the most tone-deaf, narcissistic videos that I have ever seen in my entire life. And I'm so sick and tired of blue check marks on Twitter inserting themselves into things that they have no business being a part of because they don't know what's going on. They're not even in reality. They're in Hollywood. It really is. It's very, very narcissistic. It's very tone-deaf. It's arrogant. And I saw this, and when I heard her reciting this slam poetry, I said to myself, at this point, America is just a meme. We are just a meme. That is all we are right now. And it's a very sad day when you have to finally admit that to yourself. Anyway, I'm going to leave it here for today. I hope you learned something. I hope you will look into this more and research it so you can make a more informed decision about what's going on for yourself. And also go over to Spotify, Anchor, Google Podcast, Apple. Subscribe to the podcast. You can leave me a review. And then head on over to the YouTube channel. Go watch my other videos. Like them, share them, leave me a comment. But I would really appreciate it if you would subscribe to the channel and then hit the notification bell so you know every time I upload a new video. And thank you for joining me today. I hope you have a good rest of your day. Maybe I'll do another episode here this week. Looking into the Sadorov and the Brzezinski stuff, and we'll check that stuff out. Hopefully I'll be able to do that. Have a good rest of your day, and God bless.